Recent reports in the German media have suggested that Germany and the United States are planning to put pressure on Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, and they would do this by the simple process of scaling back weapons deliveries to support its defence. This would be, as you can imagine, a massive action with historical implications far outlasting the end of this specific conflict. But is it true? What would it mean? That's what we're going to discuss in this video. The German tabloid Bild has said that sources in the German government had alerted it to a secret German-American plan to force Ukraine's hand on opening peace talks with Vladimir Putin. They have agreed, the report suggests, that Washington and Berlin will provide Ukraine with sufficient weapons to hold the existing front line, not enough weapons to retake occupied territory. In so doing, they aim to create the circumstances that will push Ukrainian President Zelensky to the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin. An anonymous government source was quoted by Bild as saying this: "Zelensky should realise that it can't go on like this. He needs to, of his own free will, turn to face his nation and explain that there is a need to negotiate." The White House hasn't commented on the reports. Indeed, don't expect it to, not with any enthusiasm. Neither Biden nor Scholz want to be seen publicly putting pressure on Zelensky for talks in this way. That said, some clues as to the potential truth behind the story came when the US mission to NATO recently commented, quote, "We will continue to support them in order to get into the strongest possible position at the negotiating table when the time comes." That was a statement that was quickly walked back and qualified after it provoked something of a pushback, as you might expect, from Ukrainian activists, which could be an indicator that it was someone speaking out of turn, giving an extremely unhelpful and false impression, for instance, or it could have been someone, as they say, saying the quiet part out loud, and then the administration trying to clean up the damage. We don't know which, if either, it was. Bild, however, rightly or wrongly, is clear that it was all just circumstantial confirmation of what their research was already showing. And it quoted a military expert, Gustav Gressel, saying that the plan, assuming that it is true, has no chance of working. Quote, "It is a misconception in the West that if you put pressure on Zelensky to sit down at the negotiating table, serious negotiations will take place. Putin doesn't want to negotiate. Putin wants to win this war. By keeping Ukraine weak, we invite Putin to believe in his victory and work for it. Only if Ukraine were on the winning track would Russia become willing to negotiate." And finally, the government figure also told Bild that Plan B was a freeze. Quote again, "What Berlin and Washington are striving for as an alternative to negotiations is a frozen conflict without agreement between the conflicting parties." Sort of like North and South Korea, which remained theoretically at war for many decades after the end of actual war, which would create a sort of peace without Ukraine ever actually having to concede that Russia now owned the territory that it occupies. So, what are we to make of this story? There are always caveats when deciding whether to treat a story as credible, let alone whether to decide to actually believe it to be true. Firstly, it has a surface-level credibility in that the US and Germany are principal donors of support that, let's face it, would like the conflict to be over, as we all would, except they don't want that to be at the cost of simply giving Ukraine to Putin, i.e. total defeat. That said, the analysis of Gustav Gressel isn't exactly rocket science. It's hard to think that anyone in the foreign ministries or military of either the US or Germany believe that Putin either wants to negotiate or indeed feels the need to negotiate right now. Indeed, Putin is quite happy, by all accounts, to sit on the status quo, not least to wait to see what happens in the US 2024 election, which might change things significantly. If he thought the weaponry against him was going to increase over time, well, that might give him an incentive. But getting the message that it's going to limp along at a barely adequate level, while Russia has turned its economy over to a war footing and feels confident it can continue to throw more human beings into the meat grinder and get more munitions to hurl at Ukrainians, time just won't feel to Putin like it's his enemy. Indeed, it's a key part of his current strategy. And especially since the Prigozhin moment has passed and Putin's position seems more stable right now than it did just a month ago. That can change, of course, could change quite quickly, but there are no indications right now that such a change is imminent. You can't imagine that the military strategists of the Pentagon have missed that rather elementary dynamic of geopolitics and warfare. But maybe. I suppose you could have a political leader, Biden, determined to avoid his advisors. I mean, Trump probably would, which is kind of why Putin's watching with interest to see what happens, I suppose. But while Biden has shown that his judgment hasn't been stellar, particularly in foreign affairs, you could say, there's no evidence that it, or indeed Germany's Scholz, is so far off base as that. A frozen conflict might be a logical outcome if you had two broadly equal sides, similarly exhausted by the fighting, bereft of the will to continue, whilst also politically denied the option to concede. But the logic of the position right now is that Russia would, in that situation, recover, recoup, rebuild its forces, while almost certainly continuing its proxy war with the sort of cyber attacks that it carries out against countries it doesn't like at the best of times, and then simply relaunch the offensive when the time is right. How could you prevent that? Well, perhaps some people suggest you could insist that if Russia keeps its current control of around 17.5% of Ukrainian territory, the quid pro quo to allowing that to happen is that what is left of Ukraine joins NATO. And that means that if Russia does launch a new attack in the future, it will be treated as an attack on all NATO countries as per the alliance agreement, which will have devastating consequences for Moscow. If I were Putin, which, for the avoidance of doubt, obviously I'm not, I would see that as a pretty feeble bluff. The West has gone to enormous lengths not to get directly involved in this conflict. Why? Because they are terrified of sparking a direct war that could escalate and go nuclear as soon as it looked like Russia was losing, which, based on conventional forces alone, they quickly would. And remember, Putin's still waiting for Trump. What price any such guarantee once Trump comes to office? Will America really back up its promise as the backbone of NATO security guarantee in that case? But it seems unlikely that the US would want that bluff to be exercised in the first place. It's reasonably well known that it doesn't have the settled will behind where that would take it. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, first briefed Biden on Russia's invasion plans, he reportedly kept a list of US interests and strategic objectives in the crisis, the sort of strategic objectives that don't really change from president to president. Number 1, don't have a kinetic conflict between the US military and NATO with Russia. Number 2, contain war inside the geographical boundaries of Ukraine. Number 3, strengthen and maintain NATO unity. And number 4, empower Ukraine and give them the means to fight. Bringing Ukraine into NATO in a situation where Russia hasn't renounced its intent to take action against it, for whatever it's worth would be worth even if it had, would run directly counter to those completely rational objectives. Now, that said, a list that's rational at the start of a conflict may be forced to change in the context of a longer conflict. As detailed analysis of a conflict by the Rand Corporation pointed out, there are no important benefits to the US from a long war in Ukraine, but there are a number of important potential costs and severe risks. So, after an extended period of relatively little progress, you would expect politicians and military planners alike to be grappling with the question, how does this end? The academic literature on what's described as war termination suggests 3 possible ways: absolute victory, armistice, or political settlement. Absolute victory is what Russia was going for and might yet again, should circumstances permit. It involves the victorious party installing a new leadership in the defeated state, occupying or annexing its territory, at worst annihilating the defeated population. At the very least, it might mean an agreement imposed on the defeated state that removes any possibility of it re-emerging as a power or reneging on what might be a burdensome settlement of reparations. That latter is what was imposed on Japan and Germany at the end of World War II, of course. Right now, it seems unlikely Putin could achieve this, and an absolute Ukrainian victory is out of the question as defined there. Zelensky's goal is to fight off Russia and reclaim all of Ukraine's territory, not to then invade Russia, march on Moscow and replace Putin while destroying Moscow's ability to wage war again. So even if Zelensky is wholly successful in his objectives, Ukraine is then having to become a highly militarized state, always on guard against the prospect of a renewed offensive by its larger neighbour, an uneasy peace at best. But it would not be total victory as defined in war. It might be more like an armistice agreement. Armistice agreements are, as I suggested before, what we saw with North and South Korea, where both sides commit to stop fighting and use mechanisms such as demilitarized zones to prevent a new outbreak. The thing is, it's hard to see why Putin would ever agree to an armistice agreement that was intended to actually last. If Ukraine had been successful in driving Russia out of all of its territory, which seems pie in the sky right now, but suppose, that's not the moment that Russia would decide to throw in the towel. Now, it might decide to do so in return for freezing the status quo where they hold the territory that they have seized. But as a lasting settlement or as a temporary pause, I can't see why it would opt for the former. That situation also would leave out options of Russia paying Ukraine reparations for the massive damage that has been caused and the lives that have been lost, of course. And then you have a full political settlement. If you could do something here based almost certainly on guaranteed independence and non-alignment of Ukraine with the West, from Russia's desired perspective, and a security guarantee against further hostilities from Ukraine's desired perspective, maybe rational actors could settle on that basis. Putin does not show signs of being a rational actor in that way. He lies routinely, breaks agreements just as easily, which means that no political settlement really holds any more weight than an armistice. And the problem with any settlement that freezes the status quo as it is today remains the same. It will reward Russia for its invasion. It will invite it to repeat the adventure in future, either with Ukraine again or indeed with others of its neighbours. These are all the good reasons why none of those outcomes seem achievable at the moment, and why you might think the build story must surely be wrong, because that should be obvious to the people who are supposed to be speculating. And yet, you still have to ask the question, at some point it is going to end. No conflict lasts forever. So, one of these unsatisfactory ends is going to become reality. At what point do the interested powers decide to force the pace on this outcome, if they can, in order to minimise the damage in total to them and to the world? You can certainly see why that logic would appeal to planners in Washington and Bonn. But really, the key challenge comes from that statement that may or may not have been the saying the quiet part out loud moment, which was this: if your aim really is to give Ukraine the strongest possible hand in negotiations, how would you go about that? What does it look like? Well, in reality, it means that Putin would feel that he wants to settle, that he would need to settle. Putin will only want to settle when there are only downsides in front of him if he continues, and he needs to cut his losses. Bear in mind, he's someone remarkably willing to endure losses in the cause of a greater imperial future for Russia. We are nowhere near that situation. Doesn't seem as though the current political leadership are really engaged with how we would actually get there. Since everyone will follow the incentives in front of them, I would suggest it would be a brave person who predicted that the end was close on the Russia-Ukraine war, barring a totally unanticipated collapse on either side, or a health emergency for Putin, or whatever that might be. But if it's true that the US and Germany are following this strategy, well, I could be wrong, but it's hard to see how that's going to end well for anybody except for Vladimir Putin.